1823, Virginia. Ezekiel Callahan dragged a branding iron across the back of a screaming enslaved woman while her children watched. He didn't flinch. He smiled. Then he forged a dead man's will, stole 600 acres of Blackwood land, and erased an entire family from their own legacy. 1842, Kentucky. His son Thomas, hiding under a new name on Pine Mountain, sat frozen at a dinner table set for 7. The door was wide open. The children were gone. All 5 of them. No blood, no tracks. No bodies, just silence and a curse 2 decades in the making. Before we go any further, if this story grips you the way it gripped me, I need you to do something. Subscribe to this channel and follow this story all the way to the end. And drop a comment. Tell me the city you're watching from. I want to see just how far this story travels. Now, let's go back to where it all began. Thomas Callahan was not the man people thought he was. To the handful of neighbors scattered across the ridges of Pine Mountain, he was quiet, hard-working, maybe a little too private. He kept his fences high and his words low. His wife Martha rarely came down to the valley. His 5 children were seen even less. Folks in Harlan County figured the Callahans were just mountain people, doing what mountain people did, surviving and minding their own business. But Thomas Callahan had a secret, and that secret had roots deeper than the oldest oak on his stolen land. "You ever wonder why that man don't never come to church?" Rebecca Mills asked her husband one Sunday morning in the fall of 1842. She stirred her coffee slow, the way she always did when something was eating at her. Her husband, Samuel, didn't look up from his plate. "Man's got his reasons, Becca." "Reasons?" She set the spoon down hard. 5 children up on that mountain, no schooling, no preacher, no doctor visits. Martha looked like a ghost last time I saw her, Samuel. A ghost. Samuel chewed his bread and said nothing. That was the thing about Pine Mountain. People talked, but nobody acted. Nobody asked the questions that needed asking. And nobody, not a single soul, knew what Thomas Callahan had done 20 years before he ever set foot in Kentucky. Let me take you back, because this story doesn't start in 1842. It starts in 1823 in the tobacco fields of southwestern Virginia, where a man named Silas Blackwood owned 43 enslaved men, women, and children. Silas was cruel in ways that don't belong in polite conversation. He separated mothers from babies. He branded runaways with hot iron. He worked people to death and buried them in unmarked graves behind his barn like they were animals. But Silas Blackwood had something else: land. 600 acres of the most fertile soil in the region, and that land was worth more than gold. Thomas Callahan's father, Ezekiel Callahan, was Silas Blackwood's overseer. He cracked the whip, he kept the ledgers, and when Silas Blackwood died suddenly in the winter of 1823, Ezekiel saw his moment. "That land should have gone to the Blackwood children," an old clerk in the Virginia courthouse would later testify. But the documents were changed, signatures forged. Ezekiel Callahan walked out of that courthouse with a deed in his hand and blood on his soul. Ezekiel stole the Blackwood land, every acre. He forged the dead man's will, bribed a county judge, and left the Blackwood family, including Silas's widow Eleanor and their 4 children, with nothing. Absolutely nothing. But here's what Ezekiel didn't count on. Eleanor Blackwood was not a woman who accepted defeat. "You think you can take what's ours and sleep at night?" Eleanor reportedly said to Ezekiel's face, standing in the mud outside the courthouse while her children cried behind her. "You will pay for this. Not today, not tomorrow, but your bloodline will pay Every last one of them. Ezekiel laughed at her. He actually laughed. He shouldn't have. Within a year of stealing the Blackwood land, Ezekiel's wife died of a fever that no doctor could explain. His eldest son drowned in a creek that was barely knee-deep. His horses went mad and had to be put down. His crops rotted in the ground despite perfect weather. Ezekiel began to drink. He began to talk to himself. Neighbors said they could hear him screaming at night, shouting at someone who wasn't there. "Leave me alone. I done what I had to do." By 1830, Ezekiel Callahan was a broken man. He sold the stolen Virginia land for a fraction of its worth and moved his remaining family, including young Thomas, then barely 15, deep into the Appalachian mountains of Kentucky. He told Thomas one thing before he died in 1834. "Don't ever go back to Virginia. Don't ever let the Blackwood name cross your lips. And whatever you do, boy, don't let them find you." Thomas buried his father on Pine Mountain and tried to forget. He married Martha, a quiet woman from a neighboring county who never asked questions about his past. They had 5 children in quick succession. Thomas built a cabin with his own hands, cleared the land, and tried to live like a man with nothing to hide. But the past has a way of climbing mountains. In the summer of 1842, something changed in Thomas. Rebecca Mills noticed it first. "He came down to the general store 3 times in 1 week," Rebecca told Sheriff Hadley months later, her voice trembling. Thomas Callahan never came down more than once a month, and he was buying strange things, salt, bags and bags of salt. I asked him, "Thomas, what on earth do you need all that salt for?" And he looked at me with these eyes. I'll never forget those eyes. And he said, "To keep them out, Mrs. Mills, to keep them out." Rebecca thought he meant wolves or bears. She told herself that's what he meant, but the look on his face told a different story. Thomas Callahan was terrified. Not of animals, of something he couldn't name. That September, the strange events began. A neighbor named Josiah Turner was hunting deer on the ridge below the Callahan property when he heard screaming. Not just any screaming, a woman's voice, high and desperate, repeating the same words over and over. "They're here, they're here, they're here." Josiah ran toward the sound, rifle in hand, but when he reached the tree line near the Callahan cabin, the screaming stopped. Dead silence. He called out. No answer. He knocked on the door. No one came. "I stood there for 10 minutes, Josiah later told the sheriff. "And I swear on my mother's grave, I could feel someone watching me from inside that house. But nobody opened that door." 2 weeks later, a traveling preacher named Reverend Amos Clay passed through the area and stopped at the Callahan home to offer his services. What he encountered shook him to his core. Martha Callahan opened the door only a crack. Her face was gaunt. Her eyes were sunken and dark. "Ma'am, I'm just passing through," Reverend Clay said, "offering prayer and fellowship to families in the hills." Martha stared at him for a long moment. Then she whispered, "Prayer can't help us, Reverend." "Nothing can help us now." Before he could respond, Thomas appeared behind her, grabbed the door, and slammed it shut. Reverend Clay heard Thomas shouting inside, "You don't talk to strangers, Martha. You know the rules. They could be listening." Reverend Clay left that mountain faster than he'd climbed it. He told people in the valley that the Callahan family was living in terror. But terror of what? He couldn't say. By November 1842, the children hadn't been seen in months. A woman named Agnes Porter, who lived on the far side of the ridge, claimed she saw lights moving through the woods near the Callahan property at midnight. Not lanterns, not torches. Something different. Something that moved against the wind. "It was like the light had a mind of its own," Agnes said. "It drifted between the trees, slow and deliberate, and then it stopped, right at their door. And then it went inside." Nobody believed Agnes. They called her an old fool with too much imagination. But Agnes wasn't the only one who saw things. Thomas Callahan made his last trip to the general store on November 28, 1842. He bought more salt, a length of rope, and a Bible. The storekeeper, Henry Dawson, tried to make conversation. "Everything all right up on the mountain, Thomas?" Thomas set his money on the counter and said something that Henry never forgot. "I should have told the truth 20 years ago, Henry. My father stole from people who knew how to take things back, and now they're taking everything." Henry didn't understand. He watched Thomas walk out into the cold, load his supplies onto his mule, and head back up the mountain. It was the last time anyone in Harlan County saw Thomas Callahan alive. December came. The first snow fell heavy and fast. Rebecca Mills, God bless her stubborn heart, decided she was going to check on the Callahan family. She baked bread, wrapped Christmas gifts for the children, and made the long climb up Pine Mountain on December 14th. What she found stopped her in her tracks. The cabin door was open. Not broken, not forced. Just open, like someone had walked out and never come back. Rebecca stepped inside and felt the cold hit her bones. The table was set. 7 places. Plates, cups, forks, knives. A pot of stew sat on the stove, frozen solid. Bread was on the cutting board, half sliced. A child's shoe lay in the middle of the floor. Just one, as if it had been dropped in a hurry. "Hello?" Rebecca called. Her voice echoed through the empty cabin. "Martha? Thomas? Children?" Nothing. She checked every room. The beds were made, clothes hung on hooks. Thomas's rifle stood in the corner, loaded. Martha's sewing basket sat by her chair, a needle still threaded, a piece of cloth half mended. Everything was there. Everything except the family. Rebecca ran. She ran down that mountain faster than a woman her age should have been able to run, and she didn't stop until she reached the valley. She burst into the general store, breathless, shaking, and said 5 words that would haunt Harlan County for the next 200 years. "The Callahans are gone. All of them." Sheriff James Hadley organized a search party within the hour. 20 men rode up Pine Mountain with rifles and lanterns, expecting to find bodies, expecting to find blood, expecting to find something that made sense. They found none of it. No blood, no bodies, no tracks in the fresh snow leading away from the cabin. No signs of violence, no signs of struggle. 7 human beings and all their livestock had simply ceased to exist. But Sheriff Hadley found something else. Hidden beneath a loose floorboard in the cabin, wrapped in oilcloth, was a leather diary. Thomas Callahan's diary. And the first entry Hadley read by lantern light made the hair on the back of his neck stand straight up. "They found us. Eleanor's people found us. God forgive my father for what he did. God forgive me for keeping the silence. The debt is coming due, and I cannot stop it. No amount of salt, no amount of prayer. They are in the walls. They are in the ground. They are everywhere, and they want what was taken. Not the land, not the money. Us. They want us." Sheriff Hadley closed the diary. He looked at the empty cabin, the set table, the frozen stew, the child's shoe on the floor. And for the first time in 30 years of law enforcement, James Hadley felt something he had never felt before. He felt certain that he would never solve this case. Not because the evidence wasn't there, but because whatever happened to the Callahan family didn't belong to the world he understood. Sheriff James Hadley didn't sleep that night. He sat in his office with Thomas Callahan's diary open on his desk, reading entry after entry by candlelight, and each page pulled him deeper into something he wished he'd never touched. The diary didn't start with fear. That's what unsettled Hadley most. The earliest entries, dated spring of 1841, read like any farmer's journal. Thomas wrote about planting season, about fixing the barn roof, about his youngest daughter learning to walk. Normal things, safe things. But by midsummer, the tone shifted. June 15th, 1841. Thomas wrote, "Martha says she hears singing at night, coming from the tree line. I told her it's the wind. She looked at me like she knew I was lying." July 3rd, 1841. Found salt circles broken again this morning. Third time this week. I poured them fresh last night. Something is crossing them. August 19th, 1841. The children won't go near the east wall. Little James says a woman stands there at night. A woman with no eyes. Martha is losing weight. She barely eats. She barely speaks. God help us. Hadley turned the pages faster. His hands were shaking, and he didn't care who knew it. September 22nd, 1841. I told Martha the truth tonight. All of it. What my father did to the Blackwoods, the stolen land, the forged will, the enslaved people he tortured. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She just looked at me and said, "Then we're already dead, Thomas. You just haven't buried us yet." Hadley closed the diary and pressed his palms against his eyes. He'd been sheriff of Harlan County for 3 decades. He'd handled murders, robberies, land disputes, and drunken brawls. But this was different. This wasn't a crime he could solve with handcuffs and a jail cell. This was something older, something woven into the very soil of the mountains. The next morning, Hadley rode back up Pine Mountain with his deputy, a young man named Elijah Combs. Elijah was sharp, practical, and didn't believe in superstitions. Hadley liked that about him. He needed someone grounded, because his own ground was starting to crack. "We're going through that cabin inch by inch," Hadley told Elijah as they climbed. "Every floorboard, every wall, every stone in that fireplace. Something happened to those people, and I don't care what Thomas Callahan's diary says about curses and eyeless women. There's an explanation. There's always an explanation." Elijah nodded. "You think somebody took them? Kidnapped the whole family?" "7 people, Elijah. 7 people and livestock, in fresh snow with no tracks. You tell me how a kidnapper pulls that off." Elijah didn't answer. He didn't have one. They reached the cabin by mid-morning. Everything was exactly as Rebecca Mills had described. The open door, the set table, the frozen stew, the child's shoe. Hadley stood in the center of the room and turned slowly, looking for what he'd missed the first time. That's when Elijah called from the back room. "Sheriff, come here, now!" Hadley found Elijah on his knees beside the children's bed. He'd pulled back the mattress and found something carved into the wooden frame. Letters, crude, shaky, carved with a knife by a hand that was clearly trembling. "E-L-E-A-N-O-R," Elijah read aloud. He looked up at Hadley. "Who's Eleanor?" Hadley felt the blood drain from his face. He knew that name. He'd read it in the diary. Eleanor Blackwood. The woman Ezekiel Callahan had destroyed 20 years ago. The woman who had stood in the mud outside a Virginia courthouse and promised that every last Callahan would pay. "Someone in this family carved that name," Hadley said quietly. "One of the children, maybe. They carved it like a warning, or a confession." Elijah stood up. "Sheriff, there's more." Behind the cabin, buried under a thin layer of frozen earth, Elijah found a wooden box. Inside the box were 3 things: a fragment of a child's dress, torn and stained with something dark, a lock of black hair tied with string, and a folded piece of paper. Hadley unfolded the paper. It was a property deed, dated 1823, bearing the name Silas Blackwood, the original deed, the one Ezekiel Callahan had supposedly destroyed after forging the new one. Somehow, it had followed Thomas Callahan across state lines, across 20 years, across every attempt to bury the past. "This deed," Hadley said, holding it up with both hands trembling, "this is the deed to the Blackwood land in Virginia, the land Thomas's father stole. How in God's name did it end up here?" Elijah took a step back.
"You're saying this family disappeared over a land dispute from 20 years ago?" "I'm saying this family disappeared over something that started with a land dispute," Hadley replied. "But it turned into something much worse." Hadley made a decision that would change the course of his life. He was going to Virginia. He was going to find the Blackwood family, and he was going to get answers. The ride took 11 days.
11 days through frozen mountain passes, muddy river crossings, and towns that looked at a Kentucky sheriff like he'd lost his mind. Hadley didn't care. He had Thomas Callahan's diary in his saddlebag and the original Blackwood deed in his coat pocket, and he wasn't turning back until someone told him the truth. He arrived in Tazewell County, Virginia, on January 8, 1843. The county clerk, an elderly man named Whitfield, remembered the Blackwood case immediately.
"Blackwood land," Whitfield said, shaking his head. "That's a name I haven't heard in years. Terrible business. Silas Blackwood died in 1823, and his overseer, Ezekiel Callahan, claimed the property through a will nobody had ever seen before. The Blackwood family fought it, took it to court, lost. Eleanor Blackwood stood right there in this office and cursed Ezekiel Callahan's name, said his bloodline would be erased from the earth." "Where are the Blackwoods now?" Hadley asked. Whitfield gave him a long, careful look. "You don't want to go there, Sheriff. I didn't ride 11 days to turn around." Whitfield sighed. "There's a hollow about 15 miles south of here, deep in the woods. The Blackwood women live there, Eleanor's daughters, maybe granddaughters by now. Folks around here leave them alone. They leave us alone. That's the arrangement." "What do you mean, arrangement?" Whitfield leaned in close. "I mean, people who bother the Blackwood women tend to have problems afterward. Livestock dying, crops failing, children falling sick. It might be coincidence. It might be something else. Either way, nobody goes to that hollow unless they have to." Hadley went anyway. He found the Blackwood homestead at the end of a narrow path that wound through dense forest. It was a small cabin, smaller than the Callahans, with smoke rising from the chimney and a garden that somehow still had green plants despite the January cold. That detail alone made Hadley uneasy. He dismounted and approached the door. Before he could knock, it opened. A woman stood there. She was old, maybe 70, maybe older. Her skin was dark brown, weathered by decades of sun and hardship. Her eyes were sharp and clear, the eyes of someone who had seen terrible things and refused to look away. She wore a plain dress and a necklace made of bones. Small bones. Animal bones, Hadley told himself. They had to be animal bones. "You're here about the Callahans," she said. It wasn't a question. Hadley removed his hat. "Yes, ma'am. I'm Sheriff James Hadley from Harlan County, Kentucky." 7 people have disappeared, and I have reason to believe your family may have information about what happened." The woman smiled. It was the coldest smile Hadley had ever seen. "Information," she repeated. "Is that what you call it? You ride 11 days through winter to ask a black woman in the woods about a white family that vanished? Let me save you some time, Sheriff. The Callahans are gone. They've been gone since the moment Ezekiel Callahan put that branding iron on my mother's back." "Since he stole our land, since he sold our people like cattle and laughed while he did it. That family was dead the day they took what wasn't theirs. It just took the earth a little while to collect." Hadley's mouth went dry. "Ma'am, are you telling me you had something to do with their disappearance?" She laughed, a real, genuine laugh that echoed through the trees. "Had something to do with it? Sheriff, I didn't have to lift a finger."
You can't steal from the dead and expect the living to stay safe.
My mother cursed Ezekiel Callahan's bloodline in 1823. She used words that don't translate into your language. She called on things that don't have names in your books. And she told him, right to his face, that every Callahan who drew breath would be taken. Not killed. Taken. There's a difference. What difference? The old woman leaned forward. Dead people leave bodies, Sheriff. The Callahans didn't leave bodies, did they? Hadley couldn't speak. He stood there, hat in hand, staring at this woman who was telling him, without a shred of guilt or hesitation, that her family had orchestrated the complete erasure of 7 human beings through means he couldn't begin to comprehend. "The debt has been paid," she said softly. "Every acre Ezekiel stole, every life he destroyed, every child my grandmother lost on that plantation. Paid in full. You can go home now, Sheriff. There's nothing left to find." She stepped back and closed the door. Hadley heard the latch slide into place. He stood there for a long time, longer than he should have, listening to the wind move through the trees and trying to convince himself that everything he'd just heard was the ranting of a bitter old woman with a grudge. But the diary, the deed, the carved name, the missing family with no tracks, no blood, no explanation, the salt circles, the singing in the trees, the eyeless woman in the walls. Hadley mounted his horse and rode away from the Blackwood Hollow. He didn't look back. Halfway down the trail, he stopped, pulled Thomas Callahan's diary from his saddlebag, and opened it to the very last entry. Dated December 13th, 1842. One day before Rebecca Mills found the empty cabin. Thomas had written only 2 lines. "She's standing at the foot of our bed. She's been dead for 19 years. But she's standing right there, and she's smiling." Hadley closed the diary. He rode back to Kentucky in silence, and for the rest of his life, he never told another soul what the Blackwood woman said to him that day in the hollow. He filed his report with the county. Cause of disappearance, unknown. Case status, unsolved. But in the margin of his personal notes, in handwriting so small you'd need a magnifying glass to read it, James Hadley wrote 4 words that would haunt researchers for the next 180 years. She told the truth. Hadley never reopened the case. He locked Thomas Callahan's diary in the bottom drawer of his desk, filed the original Blackwood deed in the county records, and spent the remaining 12 years of his career pretending the Callahan family had simply moved away in the night. That's what he told people. That's what he wrote in the official report. Moved away. No forwarding address. Case closed. But the mountain didn't forget. Pine Mountain never forgets. Spring of 1843 came slow and cold. The snow melted off the Callahan property in patches, revealing ground that looked wrong. Josiah Turner, the same neighbor who'd heard Martha screaming months earlier, was the first to notice. The soil around the cabin had turned black. Not dark brown. Black. As if something underneath had burned it from below. "Ain't natural," Josiah told his wife. "Soil don't do that on its own. Something's in that ground." His wife grabbed his arm.
You stay off that property, Josiah Turner. You hear me? Whatever happened to those people, I don't want it happening to us. Josiah listened to his wife, for a while. By summer, people in the valley started avoiding the trail that led up to the Callahan cabin. It wasn't a conscious decision. Nobody held a meeting about it,
Nobody posted a warning. People just stopped going. Hunters changed their routes. Trappers worked different ridges. Even the mail carrier, a fearless old man named Otis Pruitt, who'd been riding these mountains since before Kentucky was a state, refused to go past the Callahan fence line. "My horse won't do it," Otis said when asked. "I kick her, I whip her, she plants her hooves and won't move. Animals know things, people. Animals know things we're too proud to admit." September 1843. A full year after the disappearance. Rebecca Mills couldn't let it go. She'd been the one to find that empty cabin. She'd been the one to see the set table, the frozen stew, the child's shoe. And every night since, she dreamed about those 5 Callahan children. Their faces, their silence. The way they never played outside, never laughed, never ran through the grass like children should. "I have to go back," Rebecca told Samuel over breakfast. Samuel set down his fork. "No. Those children, Samuel. 5 children. Somebody has to look for them." The sheriff looked. 20 men looked. They found nothing. They found a diary. They found a deed. They found a name carved into a bed frame. "That's not nothing, Samuel. That's a trail." Samuel looked at his wife with an expression she'd never seen before. Fear. Real, bone-deep fear. "Becca, I'm asking you, as your husband, as a man who loves you, don't go back up that mountain." Rebecca went anyway. She always did what she believed was right, regardless of what anyone told her. She climbed Pine Mountain on September 14th, 1843, carrying nothing but a lantern and her Bible. She never made it to the cabin. Halfway up the trail, Rebecca heard something that stopped her dead. Singing. A woman's voice, low and slow, singing in a language Rebecca had never heard. It wasn't English. It wasn't Cherokee. It wasn't any language spoken in the mountains of Kentucky. It was older than all of them. Rebecca clutched her Bible to her chest. "Who's there?" she called out. "Show yourself." The singing stopped. And then, from somewhere in the trees, a child's voice answered. "Mrs. Mills?" Rebecca's blood went cold. She knew that voice. She'd heard it 100 times over the years, calling out greetings when she delivered bread and preserves to the Callahan family. It was the voice of Sarah Callahan, Thomas's eldest daughter. Sarah, who was 12 years old. Sarah, who had been missing for 9 months. "Sarah?" Rebecca whispered. "Sarah, honey, is that you?" "We're still here, Mrs. Mills. We never left." Rebecca spun around, searching the trees, searching the trail, searching everywhere. But there was nobody. No child, no woman, no living soul on that mountain except Rebecca Mills and whatever was speaking to her from the shadows. She ran. She dropped her lantern, dropped her Bible, and ran down that mountain so fast she tore her dress on the brambles and didn't even feel it. When she reached home, she collapsed into Samuel's arms and sobbed for an hour straight. "I heard her," Rebecca kept saying. "I heard Sarah. She's still up there, Samuel. She's still on that mountain." Samuel held his wife and said nothing. What could he say? What could anyone say? Word spread through the valley like wildfire. Rebecca Mills heard the Callahan girl on Pine Mountain. Some people believed her. Most didn't. But everyone, believers and skeptics alike, agreed on one thing. Nobody was going near that cabin again. The years passed. 1844, 1845, 1846. The Callahan cabin rotted slowly, its roof caving in, its walls leaning, its door hanging open like a mouth that couldn't close. Weeds swallowed the garden. The fence posts fell. The land returned to wildness, as if the mountain itself was reclaiming what had been stolen.
And then the second disappearance happened. October 1847. A surveyor named William Drake came through Harlan County, hired by a land company out of Lexington to map potential mining sites in the mountains. Drake was a practical man, educated, 32 years old, and completely uninterested in local superstitions. When people warned him to stay away from Pine Mountain, he laughed. "I've surveyed land from Georgia to Ohio," Drake told the men at the general store. "Every backwoods county has a ghost story. I'm not here for ghost stories.
I'm here for coal." He rode up Pine Mountain on October 11th with his equipment, his maps, and a tent. He planned to spend 3 days surveying the area around the Callahan property. He never came back. His horse returned to the valley on October 14th, saddled but riderless. His equipment was found scattered along the trail, as if he dropped everything and fled. His maps were shredded, not crumpled, shredded, torn into strips so fine it looked like something with claws had done it. Sheriff Hadley was 61 years old by then. When they told him about William Drake, he sat down heavily in his chair and put his head in his hands. "Not again," he muttered. "Dear God, not again." Elijah Combs, now a seasoned deputy, led the search. He took 10 men up the mountain, and this time they went all the way to the ruins of the Callahan cabin. They found Drake's tent, still standing, still staked into the ground. Inside the tent, they found his journal. His last entry was dated October 12th. Drake had written, "Surveyed the North Ridge today. Good coal deposits. Returned to camp at dusk. Found a woman sitting outside my tent. Old, dark skin, bone necklace. I asked her name. She said, 'This land isn't yours. This land isn't anyone's. This land belongs to the ones who were buried in it.' I told her I was just a surveyor. She said, 'That's what the last family told themselves too.' She walked into the woods and didn't look back." I'm packing up at First Light. He never made it to First Light. Elijah read the journal entry aloud to his men. Nobody spoke for a full minute. Then one of them, a young farmer named Jacob Hensley, said what everyone was thinking. "It's the same woman. The Blackwood woman. She's here." Elijah shook his head. "That woman is in Virginia. The sheriff talked to her 5 years ago." "Then how is she sitting outside a tent on Pine Mountain, deputy? You tell me that." Elijah couldn't tell him that. He couldn't tell him anything. He packed up Drake's belongings, led his men down the mountain, and filed a second missing persons report. Cause of disappearance, unknown. Case status, unsolved. Hadley retired in 1848. On his last day as sheriff, he called Elijah into his office and handed him a sealed envelope. "Don't open this until I'm dead," Hadley said. Elijah took the envelope. "What is it?" Hadley stared at him for a long time. "It's the truth, the real report on the Callahan case. Everything I saw, everything I heard, everything that Blackwood woman told me. I couldn't put it in the official record because no one would believe it. But someone needs to know. Someone needs to understand what that mountain is." "What is it, Sheriff? What is that mountain?" Hadley put on his coat and walked to the door. He stopped with his hand on the frame and spoke without turning around. "It's a grave, Elijah. Pine Mountain is a grave. And whatever Ezekiel Callahan woke up when he stole that land and brutalized those people, it's still awake. It's still hungry, and it's not going to stop taking." Hadley died in 1851, 3 years after retirement, peacefully in his sleep, which was more than most people connected to this case could hope for. Elijah opened the sealed envelope that same evening. Inside, he found Hadley's private account of his meeting with the Blackwood woman in Virginia. But there was something else Hadley had never told anyone.
During his ride back from Virginia in January 1843, Hadley had stopped at a county courthouse to research the Blackwood family history. What he found shattered everything he thought he understood. Eleanor Blackwood, the woman who had cursed Ezekiel Callahan in 1823, had not simply been the wife of a plantation owner. She was the daughter of an enslaved woman named Abini, who had been brought to Virginia from West Africa in 1790. Abini had been a healer in her village. Some said more than a healer. She had knowledge that plantation owners tried to beat out of her and couldn't. She passed that knowledge to her daughter Eleanor before she died in chains on the Blackwood plantation in 1811. Eleanor married Silas Blackwood in secret, an enslaved woman's daughter married to a white landowner. It was illegal. It was dangerous. And when Silas died and Ezekiel stole everything, Eleanor didn't just lose property.
She lost the one man who had treated her as human, the one man who had defied every law in Virginia to stand beside her. Elijah read Hadley's final line. Ezekiel Callahan didn't just steal land, he stole from a woman who carried the weight of 2 continents in her blood. He destroyed the only family that had ever shown her love. And then he branded her mother's people like cattle and laughed while he did it. Whatever Eleanor Blackwood unleashed on the Callahan bloodline, I cannot call it evil. I can only call it consequence. Elijah Combs folded the letter, placed it back in the envelope, and locked it in the same drawer where Hadley had kept Thomas Callahan's diary. He sat alone in the dark office for a long time, listening to the wind howl down from Pine Mountain, and he understood something that would follow him to his own grave. The Callahan case was never going to be solved. Not because the truth was hidden, but because the truth was something no court, no law, and no amount of reason could ever contain. The mountain had taken what was owed, and the mountain was still waiting. Elijah Combs served as sheriff of Harlan County for 23 years after Hadley's death. In all that time, he never once set foot on Pine Mountain. He warned every new deputy, every surveyor, every curious traveler who passed through. Stay off that ridge. Don't go near the Callahan property. When they asked why, Elijah gave them the same answer every time. Because I told you not to, that's reason enough. But time does what time always does. It makes people forget. It turns horror into folklore, turns warnings into fairy tales, turns truth into something old men mutter about in rocking chairs. By the 1870s, a new generation had grown up in Harlan County, and they didn't fear Pine Mountain. They laughed at it. 1878. A coal company out of Pittsburgh sent 3 men to survey the mineral rights on Pine Mountain. The foreman, a thick-necked Irishman named Patrick Dunn, sat in the Harlan County General Store and listened to the locals tell him about the Callahan curse. He drank his coffee and shook his head. "Gentlemen," Dunn said, "I've blasted tunnels through mountains from Pennsylvania to West Virginia. I've worked with dynamite, cave-ins, and gas leaks that would kill a man before he could scream. You think I'm afraid of a story about a missing family from 36 years ago?" An old man in the corner spoke up. It was Jacob Hensley, the same young farmer who'd searched for William Drake in 1847. He wasn't young anymore. His hair was white. His hands trembled, but his voice was steady. "Mister, I was on that mountain in 47. We found a surveyor's tent with his journal inside. Man wrote about a woman who came out of the woods and told him the land belonged to the dead. Next morning, he was gone. No body, no tracks, no trace. Same as the Callahans, same as it always is." Dunn smirked. "And you believe that?" Jacob leaned forward. "I believe what I saw. I saw a man's maps torn to ribbons by something that wasn't human hands. I saw black soil where nothing grows.
I heard things on that mountain that don't come from any animal in God's creation. You go up there if you want. I'm telling you what I told the last man who didn't listen. That mountain takes people, and it don't give 'em back. Dunn went anyway. He and his 2 men rode up Pine Mountain on March 15, 1878. They carried surveying equipment, blasting caps, and enough supplies for a week. 4 days later, 1 man came back. Just one. His name was Samuel Green. He was 24 years old, and when he stumbled into the general store, his hair had turned completely white. "Where are the others?" the storekeeper asked. Samuel couldn't answer. He stood there shaking, mouth opening and closing, tears running down his face, making sounds that weren't words. They sat him down, gave him water, wrapped a blanket around his shoulders. It took 3 hours before he could form a sentence. "Dunn's gone," Samuel finally said. "Mitchell's gone. They walked into the woods on the second night and didn't come back. I heard Dunn screaming. I heard him say, 'Let go of me. Let go of me.' And then he stopped. Just stopped. Like somebody cut his voice off with a knife." "What about Mitchell?" Samuel's eyes went wide. "Mitchell didn't scream. Mitchell walked toward the trees like he was following somebody, like somebody was calling him. I grabbed his arm. I said, 'Mitchell, don't go out there.' He looked at me, and his eyes were wrong. They were empty, like he was already gone and his body just hadn't figured it out yet. He pulled away from me and walked into the dark. I never saw him again." The storekeeper sent for the sheriff. By 1878, Elijah Combs had retired, and a new man held the badge, a practical fellow named Tom Bracken. Bracken took 4 deputies up Pine Mountain, searched for 3 days, and found nothing. No bodies, no equipment, no Patrick Dunn, no Mitchell. Just black soil and silence. Bracken came back down the mountain and told his deputies to seal the trail. "Nobody goes up there," he ordered. "Not surveyors, not hunters, not anyone. That ridge is closed." "On what authority?" one deputy asked. "On the authority of common sense," Bracken snapped. 5 people have vanished on that mountain. I'm not making it 6. But closing a mountain didn't close the story. If anything, it made people more curious. Through the 1880s and 1890s, Pine Mountain became legend. Travelers came from as far as Nashville and Richmond just to stand at the base of the trail and look up at the ridge where the Callahan family had disappeared. Some came with cameras, some came with Bibles, some came with guns. None of them went up, not after hearing what happened to those who did. 1901, a new century. A professor from the University of Virginia named Dr. Charles Whitmore arrived in Harlan County with a leather briefcase full of research notes and a theory. Whitmore was an anthropologist. He'd spent years studying Appalachian folklore, and the Callahan case had become his obsession. "I believe this case has a rational explanation," Whitmore told the local newspaper. "The Callahan family was likely murdered by persons unknown, and the supernatural elements were added by superstitious mountain folk over the decades. I intend to prove it." Whitmore hired 2 local guides and climbed Pine Mountain. He spent a week on the property, excavating the ruins of the Callahan cabin, digging test trenches, collecting soil samples. He found something no one had found before. Beneath the cabin's foundation, buried 6 feet deep in that strange black soil, Whitmore uncovered a stone. Not a natural stone, a carved stone, about the size of a man's fist, covered in symbols he didn't recognize. He wrapped it in cloth and brought it back to Virginia. 3 weeks later, Whitmore wrote a letter to a colleague at Harvard.
The letter survived and was found in the Harvard archives in 1987. In it, Whitmore described having the stone analyzed by a linguist specializing in West African languages. The symbols matched a dialect spoken by the Yoruba people of what is now Nigeria, the same region where Abeni, Eleanor Blackwood's mother, had been captured and enslaved in 1790. The symbols are consistent with protective ritual markings, Whitmore wrote. But their arrangement suggests something more aggressive, something designed not to protect, but to claim, to bind, to take ownership of a specific piece of land and everything on it. The linguistics professor told me he had seen similar markings only once before, in a photograph taken from a village in West Africa where an entire clan had vanished overnight following a territorial dispute. He refused to discuss the subject further. Whitmore never published his findings. He returned to the university, locked the carved stone in his office, and resigned his position 3 months later. His resignation letter said only, "I have looked into something that was not meant to be understood, and I find that I can no longer teach with the confidence my students deserve." The stone disappeared after Whitmore's death in 1919. No one knows where it went. 1934. The Great Depression had hit Appalachia hard. A group of 7 young men from Harlan County, desperate for work, decided to try mining coal on Pine Mountain on their own. Illegal, dangerous, foolish. But hungry men do foolish things. They went up on a Monday. By Wednesday, 3 of them came running back to the valley, wild-eyed and breathless. The other 4 were gone. "We were digging," one of them said, a boy barely 19 named Roy Campbell, "about 50 yards from where the old Callahan cabin used to be. We hit something. Not coal, not rock. It was wood, old wood, like a coffin. And when we broke through it, the smell that came out of that hole was like nothing I've ever known. Sweet, thick, alive, like the ground itself was breathing." Roy's hands were shaking so badly he could barely hold the cup of water someone gave him. Eddie went down into the hole first. He said there was a room down there, an actual room, dug into the earth, with walls and a floor and something in the center. Something wrapped in cloth. He reached for it, and that's when the singing started. Singing? A woman's voice, coming from everywhere, coming from the dirt, coming from inside our own heads, singing in words that didn't make sense. And Eddie, he just stood there in that hole and started smiling. Smiling like he was the happiest man alive. And then he was gone. He didn't fall. He didn't scream. He was standing there, and then he wasn't, like the ground swallowed him whole. Roy and 2 others ran. The remaining 4 didn't follow. They were never found. After that, the state of Kentucky officially restricted access to the Pine Mountain Ridge above the old Callahan property. The restriction was listed as a safety measure due to unstable mining tunnels. That was the official reason. Everyone in Harlan County knew the real one. 1987. A documentary filmmaker named Sandra Cole came to Kentucky to make a film about Appalachian disappearances. She interviewed descendants of Rebecca Mills, Jacob Hensley, and Elijah Combs. She found Whitmore's letter at Harvard. She located county records, property deeds, and Sheriff Hadley's sealed report. She assembled a timeline that connected every disappearance on Pine Mountain to the original Callahan case. Sandra wanted to go up the mountain. Her crew refused, every last one of them. Her cameraman, a man who'd filmed in war zones, looked her in the eye and said, "Sandra, I've been shot at in Lebanon. I'm not going up that mountain." Sandra went alone with a handheld camera. She filmed for 4 hours. When she came back, the tape was blank. Every minute of footage erased. The camera worked fine, the battery was full, but the tape held nothing. Sandra Cole abandoned the documentary. She moved to California and never spoke about the Callahan case again. In 2003, a journalist tracked her down and asked why she'd quit. Sandra's answer was published in a small Appalachian history journal. "I didn't quit," Sandra said. "I was told to stop, not by a person, not by a voice, by a feeling. Standing on that mountain, holding that camera, I felt something reach inside my chest and squeeze. Not my heart, my will, my desire to know. It was taken from me. One second I wanted the truth more than anything. The next second, I didn't want it at all. I didn't care. I wanted to leave and never come back. And I absolutely knew that if I stayed one more hour, I would be the next person who didn't come home."
Today, Pine Mountain still stands. The Callahan property is overgrown and unmarked. No plaque, no memorial, no acknowledgement that 7 people once lived there and ceased to exist on a December night in 1842. The county records list the case as unsolved. The state records don't list it at all. But if you go to the Harlan County Historical Society and ask about the Callahans, the woman behind the desk will look at you for a long moment before she speaks.
And she'll tell you what her grandmother told her, and what her grandmother's grandmother told her before that. Some debts don't die with the debtor. Some debts live in the soil. Ezekiel Callahan tortured people, stole their land, destroyed their family, and thought he could outrun the consequences by hiding in the mountains. His son Thomas tried the same thing. They were wrong. The Blackwood women didn't chase them. They didn't have to. The land itself remembers who it belongs to. The land itself collects what is owed. And if you stand on that ridge at night, when the wind goes still and the trees stop moving, you can hear it. A woman singing, children whispering, and a voice, old as the earth, that says 4 words over and over and over again. The debt is paid. But here's what keeps the people of Harlan County awake. Here's what makes the old-timers lock their doors and pull their curtains when the wind comes down from Pine Mountain. If the debt was truly paid, if the Blackwood curse took everything it was owed, then why do people still disappear on that ridge? Why did the surveyor vanish in 1847? Why did Patrick Dunn vanish in 1878? Why did 4 miners vanish in 1934? Why did Sandra Cole's footage erase itself in 1987? Maybe the debt wasn't just about the Callahans. Maybe it was about the land. Maybe Abini, the woman stolen from West Africa and worked to death on a Virginia plantation, didn't just curse one family. Maybe she cursed every hand that would ever reach for soil soaked in the blood of the enslaved. Maybe she made the mountain itself into a guardian, a collector, a judge that would never stop delivering verdicts. Nobody knows. And maybe that's the point. Some truths aren't meant to be solved. Some truths are meant to be feared. And the Callahan case, after nearly 200 years, remains what it has always been. Not a mystery, not a legend. A warning. Written in black soil, spoken in a dead woman's voice, and carried on the wind that blows forever down from Pine Mountain, where 7 souls vanished on a winter night, and the earth closed behind them, like it was swallowing a secret it would never, ever give back.